Hi everyone. I want to start playing the Marshall attack, which is a variation of the mainline Ruy Lopez. So we'll look at the Marshall attack in detail over a series of videos. And let's begin with just introducing what it is and looking carefully at the moves. All right, so the Ruy Lopez is e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5. Now the purpose of that move bishop to b5 is to pressure the knight on c6. And that knight is defending the e5 pawn. So because of that, this bishop is actually exerting indirect pressure on the center of the board. Now the main line of the Ruy Lopez continues a6, attacking that bishop, and then it falls back to a4, continuing to pressure that knight. But I wanted to point out that in this position, white cannot win a pawn by removing the defender of e5 because black can take back with the d pawn. And if white tries to win that pawn, black has a fork here, queen to d4. And when white saves his knight, black gets the pawn back. And black is exerting some unpleasant pressure on the white king, and it's probably not a good position for white. Okay, so white is not really threatening to win a pawn in the Ruy Lopez at the beginning. So instead, he drops his bishop back and retains that pressure on that knight. So you might wonder, why is black playing a6? Well, later on, white is going to get castled and place his rook on e1. And when that happens, white will be threatening to win a pawn by removing the defender because black won't be able to win the pawn back on e4 if there's a rook sitting on e1. So as soon as white is in a position to remove this defender and win that pawn, black will be ready to break the pressure on the knight with the move b5. So a6 is inserted early so that b5 can be played when necessary. Okay, so after bishop a4, the main line continues knight to f6, attacking the e4 pawn and developing the king side. And you might wonder, why doesn't black just play b5 now so that he never has to worry about his knight being captured? Well, I think there's two reasons why black doesn't normally play that move. One is you may just be forcing that bishop to a better square. This is a nice diagonal for that bishop, and it's exerting pressure on f7. But a second reason is, and this is more subtle and it takes experience to understand this, but black is just overextending his queenside pawns, and they can be subject to attack. One key move in that attack is the move a4, and sometimes white can saddle black with a weakness by attacking these pawns. Okay, so black doesn't want to play b5 unless he's provoked into doing so. So instead he plays knight to f6 and attacks this pawn. Now white can calmly calmly defend the pawn with d3, opening up the dark square bishop. And this is a slower, more positional way to play the Ruy Lopez. But the main line is actually to castle. And that threatens to get this rook to the e file to defend the pawn. So you may wonder, why not d3? What's wrong with that? Well, in the mainline Ruy Lopez, white has plans of playing c3 to support the d4 square and then push the pawn to d4, all in one move. So he doesn't want to waste a move by playing it to d3 first. White wants to get that nice classical pawn duo in the center. So instead of playing d3 here, he castles. It's a faster way to play. And the point is, if black ends up taking that pawn, then white gets excellent compensation with the move rook to e1, pressuring down the e file where the black king is still sitting. Although actually it's even stronger to play d4. Now this is a variation. It's a way to play. It's called the open variation of the Ruy Lopez. But it's not the main line. After castling, black doesn't open up this e file. Instead, the closed Ruy Lopez is the main line, which is to move bishop to e7. Now let's talk about why black makes this move. Well, obviously he wants to castle, so he's developing that bishop. Now, the reason it's well placed on e7 is because it blunts any pressure that this rook is going to be exerting down the e file. And let me explain. For example, if black had made some non-move like, let's say, h6 here, which is a bad move, then white can capture this defender of the e5 pawn, and if black recaptures with the d pawn, white can take that pawn now and not worry about this fork, queen to d4, because the knight would move and the queen can't really take here. Definitely can't take there because rook to e1 pins the queen to the king. Now imagine if black didn't play h6 and had played bishop to e7 instead. Well, with the bishop sitting on e7, this queen would be in no danger. It could simply move away and there's no pin. So that's really the purpose of bishop to e7. So black plays bishop to e7 here. And now white finally defends his e-pawn with the rook instead of with the d-pawn. Okay, because again, white is wanting to play c3 and d4. And now that white's defended that pawn, he is threatening to win black's e-pawn by capturing this defender on c6. So here is where black needs to consider what to do about that. And he plays b5. So there's going to be no bishop takes c6, removing that defender. So the bishop has to fall back. And now I'll tell you what the main line is, which deviates from the Marshall attack. The main line of this closed variation is d6, and that's not the move in the Marshall attack, though. And the purpose of this move, besides opening a diagonal for the light squared bishop, is to defend the e-pawn further so that this knight is now released to move, so it doesn't have to defend e5. And what black wants to do is move it to a5 and attack that bishop and win the bishop pair. Winning the bishop pair means taking one of your opponent's bishops so they no longer have two bishops and you still have two bishops. So you'll have the bishop pair. Okay, and because of that, white typically plays c3 in the main line, gaining an escape square for the bishop. So if knight to a5, white responds with bishop to c2. And then after that, black typically castles. And now before playing d4, d4 would be met with bishop to g4, which turns out to be an annoying pin on the white knight. So before playing d4, white preps the d4 move by playing h3 first, keeping the bishop off of g4. And then finally, white will be ready to play d4 on the next move, setting up that really nice center. Okay, but the Marshall attack is not that line. So the Marshall attack is, instead of continuing with d6 and defending that pawn, black castles. And the point of castling is black wants to play d5, actually. Black wants to be the one to get the two pawns in the center in the Marshall attack. Okay, so let's see, how does it continue from here? Well, white plays c3, again gaining an escape square for the bishop potentially, or rerouting the bishop to this diagonal, but more importantly, supporting a pawn push to d4. Okay, well, since white played his pawn to c3, he's obviously blocking in his queenside knight, and his queenside is completely undeveloped here. So that's why black is justified in striking out in the center right now with the move d5, and that begins the Marshall attack. So again, the Marshall attack is when you leave your d-pawn at home and you simply castle, and then after c3, you play d5 right away, all in one move d5. So you don't put the pawn on d6, and you strike in the center. And it's actually a pawn sacrifice. White can win a pawn here and will continue this line of the Marshall attack. The main way for white to play is e takes d5, revealing an attacker on the e5 pawn here. So while black recaptures, knight takes d5, white wins a pawn on e5. So black is sacrificing a pawn in the martial attack, and it's in order to get quick development and to get an attack on the white king while white's queenside is completely undeveloped. So from here, black will normally continue by knight takes e5. So this is the main line of the martial attack. And that draws the rook forward. And now white is attacking the knight on d5 twice. So it needs defense. And black has tried different moves in this position, and we may look at them in future videos. I'm not sure yet how this series will go. But black has tried knight to f6 to save the knight. He's tried bishop to b7 to protect the knight further. But the main line of the martial attack that masters have settled on is the move c6 to defend the knight. Okay, so here white normally places a pawn in the center and opens up a diagonal for the bishop and starts to develop their queenside. And black attacks the rook and puts the bishop on a better square, which is now pointed along this diagonal at the h2 square. Now the rook retreats down the e-file all the way back to e1. Sometimes people have played it to e2, but that does block in the diagonal of the queen. So it normally goes all the way back to e1, and now black plays queen to h4. And so we can see the purpose of putting this bishop on this square. So the queen and the bishop are teaming up against h2. And white has to respond accurately, and the main line continues g3, which unfortunately for white creates a lot of light squared weaknesses around his king side. And black still has this light squared bishop, which is pointed in that direction. Okay, and the attack continues, or black continues this main line with queen to h3, saving the queen. Okay, and I'll point out one more thing before we end this video. This move g3 is important to stop the threat on h2. For example, h3 is a much inferior move. And the reason is h3 allows the powerful sacrifice bishop takes h3, completely opening up the king here. If white accepts the bishop, black gets 2 pawns there for that bishop. But more importantly, that king on the white side of the board is in trouble. Okay. For example, there is a mate threat in the position. So let's say white tries to play bishop takes d5, reasoning, I'm going to get rid of one of the attackers, one of the pieces that black can use to attack me. But that just gives black a standard mate in 4. And it's good to know this mate in 4, by the way, if you don't already know it. It's bishop to h2 check, not queen to h2 check, which allows the king to escape to f1. But that queen is going to stay there and hold that king in place, and the bishop comes here to check, forcing the king to the corner. Now black has a discovered check with the bishop, so he's going to retreat it along this diagonal. But you have to be careful. You should retreat it to this square only, g3. And the reason for that will become clear in a minute. That forces the king to g1, and then queen to h2 check forces it over to f1. And now you can see why the bishop was placed there. It's to support the mate on f2. Okay, so it's just too dangerous for white to play h3, even if white doesn't allow that mate. This move bishop takes h3 is powerful. So instead, g3 is played. And then the queen is saved by going to h3. And we'll look at different continuations from this point onward in the next video. So thanks for watching this introduction to the martial attack.